Manderville by R. Chetwynd-Hayes. Manderville is somewhere between Wickham and Titchfield in Hampshire, and is approached, so far as it is approached at all, by means of a long lane, which runs from the Portsmouth-Fareham road to an almost uninhabited place called Tapnage. The explorer must proceed about 3/4 of a mile up the lane, pass between two houses which face each other from either side of the road, and there, on the right, is a large wood. That, so far as I can define, is the site of Manderville. A place of tall trees which loom over the railway line to the right, where deep ruts mark the passage of woodcutters' trucks, and rabbits play hide and seek under the deep undergrowth. Do not be deceived by the quiet, which is only disturbed by bird song, but on the other hand, do not walk the leaf-carpeted glades with dread in your heart, for your chance of stumbling into the main street of the lost village is very remote indeed. The student of the macabre will find reference to Manderville in Conrad von Holstein's Unnatural Enmities and Their Disposal. I quote, "Manderville, or Mandervale, was a place accursed by God, where the inhabitants did follow the path of evil, and did call upon that which doth walk the moors in moonlight, and each and every one did become foul demons that can never die, and they hid their foulness under a fair mask. Then the holy monks of Titchfield came with loud chanting, and carrying crucifixes made from the wood of the rowan tree, and surrounded the village, and although their pious prayers and incantations prevailed not against the mighty evil, the village was blotted out, and has not been seen by mortal man from that day to this." Blotted out. The forest of beer took back the fields, planted its trees where the houses once stood, and, as the centuries spread their mists along the avenues of time, Manderville was forgotten by man. But it still existed, hidden from mortal sight in a labyrinth of shifting light planes composed of atoms that had been speeded up into a mass of unseeable, unfeelable, unhearable vibrations. It was still a compact, living unit, part of a world controlled by a code of different natural laws. Paul Wheatley went into the woods to die. The reasons for his decision to depart from this world were manifold, but they could be summed up by one word: disillusion. The dreams of his youth had been strangled by the rough hand of experience. When the time came for him to choose a wife, he had clothed her in the flame-coloured drapes of romance, and she had torn them to shreds with the cruel knife of waspish common sense. In the field of commerce he had directed his envious gaze at the managerial throne, but had never been able to even find the steps that led up to that elevated position. Then, during the course of one short week, disaster struck with a twin-pointed spear, dismissal and desertion. In other words, at the age of 45, he was sacked from his job, and his wife left him. Depression became monomania, oblivion preferable to pain. So he armed himself with sleeping pills and a bottle of water, and went forth to meet the all-consuming darkness. He was, of course, reverting to the natural instinct that comes to any wounded animal that wanders into some lonely place and lays down to die. Even now his romantic dream demon had not entirely deserted him, for he visualized a comfortable falling to sleep and a nice clean decomposition under a blanket of brown crisp leaves, where he could rest undisturbed for all eternity. He stumbled along the rutted ground, past the rusting corpse of an abandoned car, then moved into the semi-gloom that lurked under the trees. He wandered for a long time while looking for the place, the dying zone, the leaf-lined grove, and once he blundered into a clearing and saw a neat wooden structure that could have been a summer house or a shelter for woodsmen. This caused him some alarm, for it suggested the possibility of residents, persons who did not just visit for work in the woods, but actually lived there, even if for a limited time. He turned and ran, crashed his way through brambles, tripped over fallen branches, and finally came to rest under a large tree. This must be the place. A bed of dead leaves was waiting. The trees murmured their sympathy with myriad green tongues, and there was no earthly reason to linger. Paul sat down, pulled his one small bottle from his pocket, and prepared for departure. The pills slipped down his throat easily enough, 3 at a time, washed down with a mouthful of water. But when the small brown bottle, with its label which read, "It is dangerous to exceed the prescribed dose," was empty, his stomach felt as if it were stuffed with cotton wool. For a while his senses were fully alert, and he suddenly seemed full of energy, as though his body was now, belatedly, announcing its willingness to carry him up into a brighter future. Then unconsciousness came upon him in a single thought-killing leap. At one moment he was, at the next he was not. He lay on his bed of crisp brown leaves, his sightless eyes looking up at the shimmering green canopy above, a casualty on a battlefield, a runner who had dropped out of the race. Paul came up from the depths of a black sea, then crashed out into the blazing reality of mind-searing awareness. For a while he lay perfectly still and waited for memory to crawl back onto her tottering throne. He had swallowed 24 sleeping pills and should be dead, but he was not. His body was a dull mass that was without strength, but the aches and general stiffness told him it was still very much alive. Then the brain permitted him to take note of the immediate surroundings, an open space, a green, lush plain that stretched out to a range of rolling hills. To his left was a village, a jumble of cottages that crouched like a sleeping bear on either side of a broad cobbled street. But of more importance were the people who stood around him, a cluster of men and women in strange clothing. The men wore doublets and hose, the women long dresses cut low in front, a few off the shoulder and loosely laced under the breasts. They all looked unsophisticated, clean, kindly of expression, and blessed with radiant health. In fact, Paul had never seen such outer signs of well-being before. Both young and middle-aged, he could see no old person in the vicinity, had clear, almost transparent skin and sparkling eyes, and to the women this lent a fresh, natural beauty that had nothing to do with regularity of features. A plump, matronly woman bent over him and asked in a soft, compassionate voice, "How do you feel, sir? Gave us quite a turn, finding you laid out like that." He managed to sit upright, and instantly strong arms were around his shoulders, assisting him to rise. Faces that wore a benign expression smiled at him. The glimmer of white teeth, the flash of clear eyes, murmured words of sympathy. He was a man who had been on a long and fatiguing journey, and has now come home. They led him into the village, and the thought could not be suppressed that this might indeed be heaven. He put the thought into words. Perhaps I died after all, but I never really believed in heaven. A tall, grey-haired man, with the face of a workaday St. Peter, laughed softly. Why, curse your heart, sir, this ain't heaven, leastways not that you'd notice. This is Manderville, a tidy little village, all things being considered, but it has its fair share of tribulations. Now, sir, if you'd expect me hospitality, the wife and me would consider it a great honour. Ain't that so, Martha? The plump, matronly woman nodded and took a firm hold of Paul's left arm. That we would. Just say the word, sir, and I'll make up the bed in the spare room. And her cooking, the grey-haired man rubbed his well-padded stomach, be not half bad. Put some meat on your bones, which, if you'll pardon the liberty, are a bit lacking in that respect. You're very kind, Paul said, aware he was now surrounded by a sea of anxious faces. Then you'll accept? Well, of course, but I really don't know how to thank you. There was a groan of disappointment from the remainder of the group, as Martha and her husband led Paul away to the first cottage on the left. The blue-painted door had a handle but no lock, and beyond lay a bright little passage that divided the house into two compact halves. Paul was ushered into a homely parlour, padded with chairs, with chintz covers, a walnut cabinet with gleaming panels, behind which a pink rose-patterned china tea-service was displayed in neat rows. Paul was pushed into a chair, and his feet lifted onto a footstool, a cushion placed behind his head, and his stammered thanks were brushed aside as pennies offered to a rich man. Please, sir, we are honoured and proud to serve you. My house out of all the others in the village, and you chose it, well, that you should be the one to give it substance is a privilege, sir. Ain't that so, Martha? Martha nodded slowly. Yes, Jem, and we must give thanks to the galloping one. Jem bowed his head 3 times, then stared reverently at the floor. Don't fret yourself, me darling. I will. Now you'd best be looking to the victuals, for the gentleman be starved. I expect he'd like to get his head down, being poorly and all. Martha bustled herself away to the kitchen, and Jem lowered himself into a chair, where he sat bolt upright, staring at his guest with enraptured eyes. Paul had now recovered sufficiently to ask some pertinent questions. How did I get here? I remember falling asleep in some woods. And you say this place is called Manderville, sir? A tidy little village. Nothing fancy about 'em, sir. Just straightforward, Satan-fearing folk who work hard 6 days a week and go to Black Mass on the 7th. Paul communed with his soul. His soul was not all that keen to consider the import of certain words, not then. And the vital question still had to be answered. But how did I get here? Jem scratched his head. Well, that's a bit difficult to answer. See, me being a simple fellow and not having much in the way of education, if you'll follow me meaning, let's say you lay down in a patch of darkness, having first walked around a spot of sunlight. Simple, sir, ain't it? Paul did not really think it was simple at all, but he was very weak and hungry, and he supposed they must have carried him here. There could be, on reflection, no other explanation. Well, it's very nice of you to all make me feel so much at home. Do you treat all strangers like this? Jem smiled. A kindly smile, but at the same time patronizing. A stranger here, sir, is a gift that must be cherished and fed and bedded down and given all its little heart desires, sir, because they're so rare, sir, as rare as a cussing person, you might say. Why, damn your liver, sir, if Martha and me hadn't got in sharp, there'd have been a free-for-all as to who was to have the honour, the great honour, of feeding and bedding you down, sir." Paul said, "Goodness gracious," an expression that was entirely out of character, but it seemed to adequately sum up the situation. Then Martha bustled into the room, all smiles and glowing with hospitality. "Victuals be on the table. Please come before they grows cold." They went into the dining-room, and there indeed was a table covered with a white cloth, and all but groaning under the weight of good things. Jem rubbed his hands, nodded with anticipatory satisfaction, then waved his guest to the nearest chair. "Sit you down, sir. You have to agree my missus lays a good table. Feed the inner man, and the outer man will look after himself." They were soon seated, Paul in the centre, with his host and hostess at the head and bottom of the table, and then the plate-filling began. A thick layer of sliced beef covered the plate from rim to rim. 5 roast potatoes, a pile of Brussels sprouts, a wedge of sizzling Yorkshire pudding, and a small mountain of green peas, all swimming in rich brown gravy. A tankard of cider stood invitingly to one side. "Get it all down," Jem instructed, "but leave a corner for a good hunk of the Mrs. Apple Pie. Don't forget to say grace," Martha reminded him, "or the thanksgiving for the gentleman being delivered to us safe and sound." Jem shook his head in mock horror. "What a woman! Do I ever forget to render thanks to him that is below, or that which do gallop across the moors?" And he closed his eyes, folded his hands, and began to intone an impromptu grace in a loud and rather pompous voice. "Dark One, who has given us eternal life and the joy of living together in strife and discord in our little community, we humbly thank you for the victuals you have seen fit to lay before us. May we eat ale and hearty, so as to be strong, and work hard in your unholy service. Be men." Martha said, "Be men, Ballyluia." After a pause, Jem again raised his voice. "Galloping One, who do haunt the moors and cry out when the moon paints the heather with silver, accept our humble thanks for the stranger who now sits at my table. May his bones be covered with fat, and his blood enriched with goodness, so that in the fullness of time your badness may be served. Be men." Then they both opened their eyes and beamed upon the more than slightly disconcerted Paul. "I hopes," Jem said softly, "you don't take exception to our simple but heartfelt piousness, sir. We're common country folk, without much book learning, but the old-time religion means a lot to our humble hearts." Paul said, I quite understand," even though he was really quite confused. Then dinner began in earnest. They both ate with considerable appetite, and never for one moment did their attention lag as to his needs. "A slice more beef, sir, a couple of more roast spuds, maybe. What about some Yorkshire pud? Bit more. Jem, what be you thinking of? The gentleman's tankard is empty." 20 minutes later found Paul gorged and more than slightly tipsy, and his feeble protests as each helping was shovelled on his plate were disintegrating into despairing groans. The apple pie was all it should be, pastry that melted in the mouth, apple that was flavoured with cloves, thick cream that oiled the tongue. Paul lost touch with consciousness midway through the 3rd helping. He woke up in a bed that had surely been made in heaven, a thick feather mattress in which his body had dug a deep warm nest, an immense pillow that all but engulfed his head, and a wonderful pink eiderdown that was so light it seemed to float, but at the same time weighed him down with a cosy, protecting warmth. He blinked, became aware of a slight headache and a twinge of indigestion that was more than compensated by his sense of well-being. He had awakened to the birth of a cloudless day. The infant sun was sending its first feeble rays through the undraped window, highlighting the heavy, old-fashioned furniture and the wallpaper, which had a pattern of tiny pink roses. This, in some inexplicable way, was comforting, and added to his feeling of well-being. It was the kind of wallpaper that might be found in a rarely used cupboard, or be revealed when a brash, modern covering had been torn away. It made Paul think of his long-dead childhood years. Gradually, the village came to life. A cock crowed, a dog barked, a door was opened, and, from the street below, came the sound of the slow clip-clod of a passing horse. Then came calls, early morning greetings, the creaking rumble of a cart, the clank of milk churns, and suddenly the day was on its feet, beginning the uneventful journey to another sunset. The sounds merged together and created a just right atmosphere. There was no stress here. Every simple task fitted into a time-hallowed background. Here, wives would never think of leaving their husbands. Men could not be sacked from their jobs, because labour and employment were one. Paul got out of bed and instantly became aware that he was attired in a long flannel nightgown. On a chair was his suit, which had been neatly cleaned and pressed. Also, his underclothes and shirt had been washed and ironed. Martha, with the primitive means at her disposal, must have worked into the small hours to perform this minor miracle. As he dressed, his attention was drawn to an illuminated text, which hung on a wall over his bed. It was made from a piece of varnished cardboard, and the beautifully executed copperplate script was comprised of red and blue letters. It proclaimed simply, "The galloper wants blood, only blood, and nothing but blood. Be men." There was a little red star at the top, and a blue one at the bottom. Paul allowed the words to go tripping over his brain. The galloper wants blood. So the village, and his host in particular, belonged to some obscure religious sect. That surely was not unusual in these out-of-the-way places. The blood, of course, was symbolic. There might even be some kind of ritual where the blood of an animal was offered to this mythical galloper. Then he remembered the grace before dinner, the following prayer of thanksgiving for his arrival, and earlier mention of a black mass. He shrugged. It was no business of his. Man's spiritual bents were legion. After a timid tap on the door, Jem entered, carrying a can of hot water in one hand and a large towel in the other. He performed an odd little bow, then smiled with kindly concern. "I hope, sir, you've slept well, and have recovered from your nasty turn." "Oh, yeah, I fear your cider was too much for your run-down constitution, sir. No more. The missus was upset, sir." "Jem," she said, "you've made the poor gentleman ill with your rotten old cider, but not to worry. I can see you're as lively as a cricket this morning. I brought the hot water, sir. You'll find one of me old razors on the washing stand. Breakfast will be ready when you are." With a final smile, he ambled from the room and closed the door, leaving Paul with an easy mind and a growing appetite. Breakfast was no less plentiful than dinner, and by the time Paul had worked his way through an enormous bowl of porridge, grilled kidneys, mushrooms, liver and bacon, buttered toast, and a pint of tea, he was forced to loosen his belt and to give vent to a series of belches that demanded an instant apology. "Don't mention it, sir," Jem reassured him. "It's a poor belly that never rejoices. Just let it rip, sir." "Well, now," Paul decided he must reveal an intention that had been troubling him for some time. "You have done me proud. Your hospitality is something I will remember all my life. Not a word, sir, Jem objected. No, but I really must not impose on you any longer. May I say, however, that you have restored my faith in human goodness, and I will never again resort to the measure that I took. Both man and wife seemed overcome with emotion, and Martha wiped away a tear on the corner of her white apron. So, Paul came to the crux of the matter. It remains for me to repeat my heartfelt thanks and leave. Husband looked at wife, then both turned towards the would-be deserter. Leave? Jem was quite unable to contain his astonishment. Where would you go, sir? Well, back the way I came, to Wickham, and catch a bus to Fareham. They tossed the names back and forth, and astonishment was replaced by awe. Wickham? Fareham? Bus? Paul frowned, assuming he was being subjected to a brand of rural ridicule. Yes, we can't be far from the main Portsmouth road, can we? Will you kindly direct me? Jem shook his head with apparent bewilderment. It's easy to see you are an educated gentleman, sir. You're able to rattle off the names of all these places what I've never heard of. See, I've lived here, man and boy, for nigh on, well, as long as maybe, but I've never heard tell of a Fareham or a Wickham. No, not in these parts. Oh, well, then perhaps you'll tell me the name of the nearest town or village. A look of profound distaste passed over faces of both of the opposite, and Paul had the impression that he had committed a well-nigh unforgivable social crime. You wouldn't want to go there, sir, Jem whispered. Not to Loveville. Being an educated gentleman, you must know it can be spelt in a different way. Goolsville, Martha breathed. A nasty low place, packed with ill-mannered ghouls, with feeding habits that don't bear thinking about, Jem added. Paul came to the conclusion that they were simple, kindly, but mad. He said, Good God, quite loudly. Begging your pardon, sir, Jem said reproachfully. We'd be pleased if you didn't use that expression in this house. It's not nice, Martha stated. Not nice at all. Paul got up with the intention of being polite but firm. Jem also rose from his chair, and his round, honest face wore an expression of quiet determination. Well, don't worry, I'll find my way somehow. You still intend to leave, sir? Paul nodded. Well, yes, I really must. They both spoke together. We couldn't allow that, sir. Not now. Not now, Martha said. It wouldn't do if you were to go and get contaminated by them common ghouls. Besides, Jem said gently, having been blessed-cursed with the gift of a stranger, it would be downright ungrateful of us to let him go, if I make myself clear, sir. Paul could understand that there was little point in wasting further words, so he turned and walked quickly toward the door, satisfied that the dictates of common politeness had been observed, and he could now leave with an easy conscience. It is unfortunate that he did not look back, for he had scarcely placed one foot in the passage when something very heavy struck him on the back of the head, and he plunged down into a pit of roaring darkness. Paul Wheatley came back to consciousness and was instantly aware of an aching head, darkness, and the sound of chanting voices. He lay still for some little time and marshalled these unpleasant facts into an unavoidable conclusion. He was a prisoner. He was lying on the bed. The window had been boarded up, and down in the main street the inhabitants of Manderville were rejoicing over his predicament. Stranger be shut in house, Jem got him trapped like mouse. Feed him up and make he fat, so Galloper can lap his blood like a cat. He told himself that they were all mad, but that was no consolation. He moved his right leg, and the chain rattled. After paying full respect to his aching head, he sat up and stretched out an enquiring hand. There was a manacle round his right ankle, and this was attached to a chain that was padlocked to the bedpost. Undoubtedly, this was hospitality carried to the extreme and a bit beyond. Paul fell back on the bed and tried to curb his fevered imagination. Jem and Martha came up, bearing a lamp and a tray of food, and it was as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened, that the practice of knocking a guest over the head and chaining him to the bed was not worthy of discussion. Jem placed the lamp on a bedside table, and Martha laid the tray on Paul's lap, and they both beamed with solicitous goodwill. "There we are, sir," Jem said. "A nice steak and kidney pud, with some new taters and a good helping of greens. Get that down ye, and there'll be naught to worry about. Be careful of your chain, sir. It's a bit painful if it gets wrapped round the old ankle." "There's suet pudding set to follow," Martha said proudly. "Nothing like suet pudding to keep out the cold." Paul had a ridiculous feeling it would be extremely ill-mannered of him to mention the little nature of bodily assault, but at the same time he could hardly let it pass without some comment. "Look here, did you have to do what you did?" "Don't let the pudding grow cold," Martha said. "And I demand you remove this chain. Maybe a little drop of pepper on your spuds," Jem commented. "If you let me go now, I promise no further action will be taken. I'm not an unreasonable man, and quite understand that your forcible conduct was the result of a temporary aberration." "Don't he talk nice?" Martha exclaimed. "Such jaw-cracking words." "Education is a great thing," Jem remarked ponderously. "The Galloper will be that pleased to lap from a wordy gent. Do you remember the last gift?" Martha set her mouth into a thin line of disapproval. "Indeed I do. I'm glad that Sarah Jenkins had him and not us. The language was such to try the patience of a devil. Of course he was more fit company for a ghoul than a Satan-fearing woman." Jem chuckled. "Kept a shouting, he did. You're all bloody mad." "Jem Broadwick, mind your tongue. What will the gentleman think of you? And him about to be lapped by the Galloper?" Jem touched his forelock, an action that Paul had often read about, but had never seen before. "Beg pardon, sir. I'd forgotten your delicate ears, sir. Now, me and the missus will leave you to it, and we'll bring up the suet pud as soon as you're ready. Just rattle your chain." Paul ate his steak and kidney pudding, and really enjoyed the suet pudding and treacle that followed. This was surprising, as the circumstances of his confinement were not conducive to a good appetite, but the food was there, and eating did help to pass the time. In the meanwhile, the chanting had ceased, and had been replaced by a strange, oppressive silence that was not broken by so much as a footstep, dog bark, or even the wind. Paul realized that he had never experienced such a total silence before. When he moved his foot and the chain rattled, the sound was like a thunderclap. There was an almost overwhelming urge to shout, scream, throw the empty plate against the wall, anything to fill the silent void which surrounded him. Time passed, perhaps an hour, and presently he did call out, a frail, plaintive shout that was instantly swallowed by the hungry silence, and no one answered. He was alone in the house, perhaps in the village, and were it not for the chain, this would be an excellent opportunity for him to escape. He pulled, kicked the bedpost, hit the padlock with his fist, all to no avail. The sacrificial lamb was securely tethered, and it could only bleat and try not to conjecture on its probable fate. At last, the silence was broken. At first, a far-away pounding, like the rapid beating of a giant drum. Then it quickly emerged into the sound of galloping hoofs. But the crashing impact, which became more pronounced as the sound grew nearer, was clearly being made by a creature of gigantic proportions. The shuddering thud, thud, began to build up into a thundering roar that made windows and doors rattle and caused Paul to tremble on his bed. And all the normal sounds were suddenly released. Dogs barked furiously, the wind sprang into howling, chimney-rumbling life. A nearby chicken community sent out a storm of protesting cackles, and from somewhere, just outside the village, a chorus of voices chanted a fearful dirge. "The Galloper has come to Manderville, straight from his cave under Dead Man's Hill. The Dark One gave him life in days of old. Now we must feed him on blood that's not cold. The stranger's a vat, filled to the brim. His body's not fat, but his eyes are not dim. He's plenty to give and lots to spare. The Galloper of the moors will enjoy fine fare." The chanting died away. The wind sank to a moaning sigh, and the galloping feet slowed down to a lumbering walk. Paul heard them enter the main street. Suddenly, a lone voice rose up and rang out across the village, like that of a priest trying to appease some hungry, enraged god. "Galloper, Brother Jem and Sister Martha have a gift which will make your belly rumble, your mouth water, and fill your heart with fire. Accept our offering, we beg of you, so that we may continue to be and exist in the spirit of discord and harmony that has been ours for centuries past. For we are Satan-fearing folk, simple folk, O Galloper. So let thy great nose smell, thy taste buds quiver, and permit us to bring forth the black bucket in which will bubble that which will be thine. Be men." A veritable fusillade of "be mens" put the stamp of approval on this simple, impromptu prayer, although the reason for its recital was tugging at a chain, fired by a completely hopeless desire to get under the bed. The earth-shaking footsteps were approaching very slowly down the street, and with them came a sound that resembled a steam engine that is working under full pressure. It took some time for Paul to realize that this must be caused by air being inhaled and expelled by a pair of monstrous lungs. The footsteps stopped just beyond the shuttered window and were quickly succeeded by a terrifying sniffing, an extravagant snuffling that suggested a mammoth with a bad head cold. Little trails of yellow mist seeped around the shutters, and, as they drifted across the room, Paul was enveloped in an overwhelming stench and a limb-paralyzing coldness. He screamed, and the thing behind the window answered with an ear-shattering roar, before moving away and breaking into the former pounding gallop. The sound ceased just beyond the confines of the village, and Paul had a mental picture of something monstrous, huge, standing waiting with a great red tongue lolling over its drooling jaws. The solitary voice was again raised in prayer. "Have patience, we beg of you, O Galloper. The black bucket stands ready. All that is needful is prepared, and the vat, the thrice-blessed cursed vat, is full to overflowing." They all broke into a run. Paul could hear them racing down the road, some shouting, a few singing. One was cursing with remarkable fluency, but clearly speed was considered to be of the utmost importance. Paul heard the front door crash open. Then Many and heavy feet ascended the stairs. Jem's voice called out, "Hold your horses! I've got the key, ain't I? Elder, have you the bucket and the apparatus?" A voice that Paul recognised as belonging to the composer of the prayers said, "Aye, that I have. Get a move on. He seems frisky tonight. The sooner his whistle be wetted, the better." The door opened, and they came in, all dressed in white robes, with hooded cowls that almost hid their faces. They might have been monks gathering round the bed of a sick layman, but they were not. A huge, gaunt-faced old man, with bristling grey eyebrows and hairs growing out of his nostrils, peered down at Paul, then rubbed his hands with sombre approval. "Galloper has drunk from worse. I wouldn't say he's what you might call bloated, but he's not bad," he called over one shoulder. "The black bucket and the apparatus. Bring." The old bucket, made of iron, was most certainly black, dented in several places, and was unnecessarily large. The apparatus proved to be a length of rubber tubing, something that appeared to be a kind of primitive pump, and a needle of alarming size and bluntness. The elder had large hands, but they were not particularly steady. "Hold him down, else how am I going to get the needle in? He does thresh about, doesn't he? I don't want to thump him over the head. Ah, that's it." Martha was seated on Paul's legs. 2 eager volunteers were pressing down on his shoulders, while Jem took a firm grip of his left arm. His voice was soothing, respectful. "Don't mind yourself, sir. Just a drop to wet the galloper's whistle. Don't mind. He's got a mighty big whistle." "Now don't carry on, sir. It was only me humour. Won't be more than a couple of pints out of you, more or less, and we'll feed you up again afterwards." The needle went into his arm like a blunt knife being forced through teak, and he screamed very loudly when the pump began to draw off his life essence. The splish-splash in the black bucket was a terrifying sound, and it seemed it would never stop, pumping, until there was a lump of hard, lard-like white flesh, fit only for a hole in the ground. Even in the midst of his red-tinted terror, he realized how strange it was that he, who so recently had tried to end his life, was now desperately afraid lest it be drained away. The pumping ceased, and the elder peered anxiously into the bucket. "Think that ought to be enough? Galloper has a rare old thirst, and if he's not getting his whack, there's no telling what he'll do." Jem nodded gently and looked at his neighbours with an air of pious wisdom. "Galloper ain't like us friends. He understands and will forgive our caution. He knows the well isn't bottomless, and if overmuch is taken today, there'll be naught for tomorrow. All praise to Galloper." Everyone murmured, "Be men," as the elder snatched up the bucket and led his flock from the room. Not before time, if the ferocious roar from the end of the street was any criterion. Paul lay limp on the bed, staring up at the clean white ceiling through a red roaring mist. "They have taken too much." The words ran across his mind like frightened carrion rats. "I'm going to die because they took too much." Then, because he was so weak, he began to cry. To die once was a tragedy. To die twice was stupidity. Paul Wheatley did not die, and in fact recovered very quickly from his loss. This afforded him a mixture of gratitude and amazement, and caused him to overcome his recently acquired repugnance for Jem and Martha, and ask a simple question. "Why?" Jem scratched his head, and Martha added another spoonful of strawberry jam to the rice pudding. "That be a question, sir. Maybe it's the air. 'Tain't the same since the monks did something horrible back in olden times. Death ain't welcome here, sir, and well he knows it. Why, curse your heart, sir, there ain't been a laying out of a body in Manderville since old Amos fell in the threshing machine. Then he was in so many bits The Black One himself couldn't have put him back together. Now, you get that rice pudding down you, and later, maybe, I'll take you out for a walk." "On the long chain?" Martha added. Hope came out of hiding and raised a tremulous head. A walk? They were going to allow him out of the house, albeit on the end of a long chain, and surely somewhere along the route, even if only the length of the street, he would find an opportunity to escape. He had to. The prospect of an endless life spent giving his all to a galloping divinity would not be tolerated. He actually managed to conjure up a smile. "That would be nice," he said. The sun was setting and transforming the window into a golden screen when Martha entered with a bowl of hot water and proceeded to prepare him for the proposed outing. "Can't have the neighbours seeing you in a mess," she said, while scrubbing his face with a coarse flannel. "We won't worry about the whiskers. A beard isn't such a bad thing. Now, bend your head to one side, sir, so I can get to your ears. That's it. Now the other one. My, we're looking better already. A good rub with a towel? Look, really, I can manage myself," Paul protested. Martha took up a large comb and began to disentangle his matted hair. "Fudge and fiddlesticks, sir. You've been poorly, and it's only proper that someone do little jobs for you. That's what men are for, to be made a fuss of. Now," she stood back and creased her face into a beam of complete satisfaction, "don't we look a picture? No one would believe that you'd given 2.5 pints of blood. Shows what good food will do." Paul said he was very grateful, deciding that a certain amount of lip service was necessary, if only to assure them to his complete submission. It was then that Jem entered, carrying a large leather collar and a long chain. He stopped just inside the doorway and allowed himself to be overcome with joyful admiration. "Don't he look grand? Don't he just? I can't wait to show him off to them Wilkins lot down the road. Never believe he'd given nearly 3 pints. "Was it 3 pints?" Martha said. "I thought it was only 2.5. "Well, we took a drop more for good measure. You know something? I think he's good for 4 next time. Set up a record." "You'd like to set up a record, wouldn't you, sir?" Paul gave them to understand that such an honour was in keeping with his innermost desires. Jem approached with a leather collar. "Duck your head down, sir. That's it. Comfy? Then we'll be on our way. Just a little trot round the houses, maybe a run across the moors. Back in about an hour, Martha." Like a trained bear, Paul went forth into the main street of Manderville, and its inhabitants were there to watch and admire. The elder, tall, gaunt, overflowing with pious ill-intentions, stalked with majestic gait down the centre of the road, and looked upon the chained stranger with gleaming eyes. "So, brother Jem, you're off, taking the gift for an airing. 'Tis well, for does not the bad book say, 'Treat well that which I send you, for a well-polished tap brings forth clean water. All praise to Galloper.'" Jem bowed his head and spoke in a hushed voice. "Will you give us your unholy cursing, please, elder?" Jem nodded and raised his right hand, with the first 2 fingers parted in a back-to-front V sign. Then he closed his eyes and spoke in a loud voice. "Go forth along the dark path. Flaunt not your sinfulness before men. Frown not upon the good doer, but rather try to turn him from his ways, and be assured of the Black One's benign malevolence for all eternity. Be men." The elder opened his eyes. After smiling sweetly upon the enraptured audience, he clenched his fist and punched Jem violently in the stomach. The big man grunted, then wiped away a solitary tear. "Thank you, elder," he said in a choking voice. "You're a wonderful example to us all." The walk began in earnest, with slack chain clanking behind him. Paul ambled past a line of gently cursing Mandervillites, who sometimes broke off this pious exercise to slap each other's faces. kick the odd ankle, punch a jutting chin. At last the village limits were reached, and Paul strode purposely out onto the moors, which, rippled by the wind, painted gold by the dying sun, stretched out their wide arms to the distant hills. It was all so natural, so matter-of-fact, and Paul would have dismissed the village which lay behind him as a particularly unpleasant dream, had not Jem suddenly tightened the chain and jerked him back into the realms of unreality. "Hold it there. No need to overdo it on the first day. Little stroll and then back to Martha's broth and dumplings." Paul slackened his pace and eyed his guard with a growing disquiet. He was certainly a formidable customer, a mass of bone and muscle that would require hitting hard and possibly often with a heavy object before escape could even be a remote possibility. He looked around for a likely weapon and was not encouraged by the absence of a sizable stick or stone that might have been utilized. Fortunately, Jem drew his attention to the obvious. "I hope, sir, that the chain be not too heavy. I favours a bit of rope myself, but the elder is fair gone on a length of chain." The chain was made out of thick, wrought iron links, and would without doubt incapacitate the most muscle-bound person if wielded with vigour and accuracy. Paul fell back until he was walking level with his host. Jem treated this manoeuvre as a friendly gesture. "Now, sir, I calls that downright condescending of you to walk alongside me like this. It does my heart good, sir." "Not at all," Paul murmured, gathering up a length of chain in his right hand. "No, sir, I'm what you call moved, and if I can ever do you an ill turn and push you down on the ladder to glorious eternal damnation, then you can rely on me. Darn me breeches if you can't." Then he began to sing. "There's a burning rock waiting for me on that smoky shore," when Paul hit him over the head with a doubled-up length of chain. The blow was delivered with all the frenzy of a man who has never hit anyone before and lacks the assurance that he is capable of inflicting injury. Jem said, "Oh, my devil!" and went down like a dynamited oak tree. Then he turned over, and while rubbing his head, looked up at Paul with becoming gratitude and admiration. "You've become a convert, sir. You've been saved from eternal blissitude. May the Galloper be praised. Never thought you'd do me such an unexpected ill turn." He removed his hand from his head and was about to get up when Paul struck him again. This time the chain bounced on the thick skull, and Jem, after murmuring, "He's pouring his madness upon me," temporarily lost contact with the world of awareness. It took more courage than Paul realized he possessed to search the person of the strenuously breathing man who displayed the marked signs of a not very distant recovery. To his horror, Jem's pockets were empty. No money, no means of identification, no key. At last, terrified lest Jem wake up and repay ill turn by well-intentioned mayhem, he gathered up his chain and ran. He ran without thought. He ran without consideration. He ran until his lungs croaked their protest and his heart thudded a dire warning. Then he slowed down to a rapid walk and dared to look back in the direction of Manderville. The village was hidden in a fold of moors, and he was lost in a sea of heather, stranded in the middle of a sunlit nightmare that must soon be blanketed by the cloak of night. But he had hope that, encouraged by freedom, flared up into a feeble flame. Surely, if he were to keep walking, civilization represented by roads, electric light, and interested policemen must lie somewhere ahead. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of urban misery existed, without any possible doubt, beyond those glowering hills. Yes, they were a long way off, but now he had a goal to strive for, a reason for walking, even, heaven forbid, running, and he would not stop until he was in a friendly, lighted room, drinking hot tea and pouring out his story to sympathetic, if somewhat incredulous ears. Paul Wheatley walked through the orange haze cast by the setting sun, and all the while his ears strained for the sound of pursuing footsteps or the shout of triumphant voices, but all he heard was the cry of the screech owl. The sun went down into a golden sea of flame, and was shortly extinguished by the cold hands of night. Then the moon crept up from behind the hills, and real terror came to Paul Wheatley. The sun had set to his immediate left, and the moon was rising only a few degrees to the right. As darkness deepened, the stars, like flickering candles on a Christmas tree, sprang into being, and he knew they were all wrong. 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 Too big, in the wrong places, brighter, moving too fast. A diamond-studded canopy that belonged to another time level for all he knew, another planet system. Hope fled before the whining wind of despair, and he sank down into the purple heather and cried. The night reached maturity. The great moon, its mountains standing out like monstrous carbuncles, raced across the velvet sky, and presently there was almost total darkness, broken only by the ever-moving stars. It is possible that Paul's mind, unwilling to face the awful reality of the unreal, withdrew for a spell, but if so, he was wrenched back into the world of reality, and rudely awakened by a flickering, eye-searing sight. He was surrounded by a group of men, each one holding a flaming torch. Eyes had to be rubbed, lids blinked, mind cleared of all thought, and then the first impressions carefully dissected before the panic came, howling across his brain. Firstly, the men had not come from Manderville. Of that Paul was certain. The Mandervillites had, whatever their religious peculiarities, kindly and, above all, human faces. Those that looked down at him now were neither kindly nor particularly human. Long, white faces with pointed chins and flanked by ears that might have been liver-colored wings. Watery eyes that seemed on the point of spilling down over the sunken cheeks. Black teeth that dimpled the slavering lips. All appeared to have been hastily aroused from an unsavory bed. Stained pajamas, grimy nightgowns, tattered winding sheets. One, a dandy with some pride in his appearance, had a dead lily thrust through a buttonhole in a pajama jacket. They gurgled, grunted, wheezed, bubbled, sniffed, rumbled, and one spoke. "It be a stranger. Worms, maggots, and all things nice. It be a warm-blooded stranger." Gurgles, rumbles, bubbles, wheezes, and grunts emerged into words. "It be a tender piece. Terrible. Rippable. Eatable. Should ripen a treat." Paul ventured to ask a question. "Who are you?" Something in soiled green pajamas looked wonderingly at a thing in a stained winding sheet. "He wants to know who we be." Stained winding sheet nodded with awful solemnity. "Ah, that he do. Reckon he's never heard of the ghouls of Loughville." A cold wind came whistling across the moors and ruffled the matted hair, stirred the stained night attire, and made Paul shiver. He suddenly felt homesick for Manderville. How wonderful it would be to wake up in his cosy bed, see Martha with a tray of wholesome steak and kidney pudding, and know that there were no such creatures as ghouls who pilfered their rotting rags from broken coffins. He tried hard to scream when they moved in, baring their teeth, dribbling, crooning, reaching out skeletal hands that plucked at his clothing, patted his face, and wriggled into his hair. Then that which wore the dead Lily, the overseer, foreman, chief, rumbled a warning. "Don't harm him, lads, no tearing till he be dead. First he must be planted, then, when he's nice and ripe, dug up for the great eating. There'd be a chain for dragging he along," observed something in a flannel nightgown. They pulled and tugged, passing the chain from hand to hand, and Paul was dragged to his feet and led away while emitting a half-strangled scream which rang across the moor as a terror-born cry for help. Dead Lily urged his grisly crew onward, with encouraging grunts interposed with the occasional jocular remark. "Pull me hearty, me graveyard nibblers. A well-run corpse makes easy burying." He was being pulled up the lower slopes of the towering hills, and his shadow writhed and danced in the bright moonlight, and seemed to flinch away when other black shapes came slithering back. He was walking in the silver-tinted land that lies buried in the dark loam of dead childhood. This was the dream that brings the child scurrying up from its pillow, makes the mother come hurrying into the dimly lit room. All the 4 dimensions of the universe were jumbled together as he lurched up the hillside, the past, the present, the side past, the side present, but no future. That was being eaten up by the insatiable maw of now. Flaming torches intermingled with the glaring headlights of a car. The towering hills were a backcloth for a house high up on a grassy bank. The grotesque moon fought for supremacy with the rising sun. For a terrifying, lucid moment, Paul Wheatley knew all the secrets of time and space, understood why a face looked round the edge of an open door, how a dead man could smile across a crowded room, comprehend why a foul-faced demon would walk down an empty road. Then all this knowledge fled like a mouse startled by an opening door, and he was again a sweating carcass that housed a screaming soul. The pounding hoofs came from far, far away. At first Paul dismissed them as the furious beating of his heart, but the ghouls knew them for what they were. They stopped, dropped the chain, and stared with glistening, watery eyes towards the east, the graveyard of the sun, the cradle of the racing moon. Pound, pound, pound. The drumming vibrations grew swiftly nearer. The earth trembled, small shapes scurrying through the heather, and something immense gradually took on corporate form and came galloping towards the hills. The ghouls gathered together in a gibbering, hand-wringing, head-nodding, shivering group. Then, as the drumming hoofs grew into a furious crescendo, turned and became a number of pale, fluttering forms fleeing up the hillside. Presently, all that Paul could see were wind-rocked, moon-whitened gorse bushes. He turned to face the night monster, the galloper of the moors. A few shreds of knowledge remained, and he knew it for what it was. Manufactured from the excrement of humankind, given life by superstition and black fear, shaped by the horror dreams of long-dead ancestors. It was a Frankenstein creation that had always roamed the wild hinterlands that lay just beyond the frontiers of sanity. 20 feet tall, scaled body, long, tapering tail, a black face that was both beautiful and repellent, large, bright, and so very intelligent eyes, 2 well-shaped legs in the front, and a pair of short, grotesquely thick ones in the rear. The hoofs were black and appeared to be highly polished. Just below the jutting breast were 2 long arms that terminated in beautiful white hands. It was the epitome of all that man most desired: beauty, intelligence, speed, fear, and the greatest of these was fear. Paul could do no more than fall to his knees and worship. All the inhabitants of Manderville came trooping up the hill with Jem and Martha to the front, and the elder not far behind. The chanting voices were not unpleasant, for they soothed, had the right and proper note of worshipful respect, and were completely free from fear. Martha and Jem helped Paul to his feet, then looked up at Galloper. "We'd like to thank thee, Galloper," Jem said with great sincerity, "for saving the gift from them common old ghouls, and I speak for all of us when I say you will not lose by this night's work. Martha and me will feed him up, so that in no time at all blood will squirt out of his ears. You'll have many a bucketful, that you will. Be men." "I've got a nice hot pot on the stove now," Martha stated, "and there's a big jam sponge to follow." Galloper laid back his head and roared, and a host of grey shapes rose up from the heather and went floating off across the moor. The elder apparently decided that his voice was the official one, and as such must be heard. He approached Galloper and tilted his head back as far as it would go. "Galloper, I hope you will forgive Brother Jem for speaking out of turn, but he was right to put out, lest the gift be tore and eaten by those ghouls. But I'm sure you will be pleased to know the gift is coming along nicely. It bashed Jem over the head with its chain, which shows a proper spirit of pious vindictiveness as anyone could hope for. That's all I have to say. Be men." Galloper seemed to think that this was highly satisfactory, for he roared once again and flattened the elder into the ground by a single movement of his right front hoof. Everyone, Paul excepted, cheered very loudly at this act of divine approval, and Jem hugged Paul in his powerful arms and did a little dance of pure joy. "I'm going to make you a promise, sir, and old Jem ain't one to make a promise lightly. When Galloper, praise be his name, has sort of slaked his thirst, then, by jingo, I will personally see to it does the same to you. Bashes you into red-hot glory, sir, by flattening you into strawberry jam. You've got my word, sir." "Ain't that nice?" Martha said, her face one big smile. "Something to look forward to." It was then that a ghost appeared. A tall man in a new raincoat, with a black bag in his left hand, suddenly appeared immediately to Paul's front. He peered into his eyes, felt his forehead, then said quietly, "Poor fellow, extensive brain damage. Often happens with these would-be suicides. Better put him in a straitjacket." He then disappeared. Of course, the new acting elder, a mean, suspicious fellow, insisted that the gift be securely tied by a stout rope, and it was like a rather crudely wrapped parcel that Paul was carried down the hill, away to the motionless Galloper, and back along the way to Manderville. As he was jolted, nudged, patted, talked about by kindly, if excited voices, the thought came unbidden into his brain and expressed itself in low but distinctly spoken words. "If I only knew how, I could make all this disappear." But of course, he never did. Ever.